Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief. On today's program, we'll be talking about Iran and the Israel-Hamas War. As fighting rages in Gaza and the prospects for regional escalation continue to mount, Iran will remain a critical actor to watch. It's not only Israel's main regional foe, but also the leading provider of military aid and training to Hamas. Given the centrality of Iran in this latest Middle Eastern war, understanding how Tehran views the conflict and its endgame will be critical. You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. To discuss this timely and important issue, I'm joined today by Alex Vatanka, Senior Fellow and the Director of MEI's Iran program. Alex, welcome back to the program, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Alistair. Great to be back.
Alex, let's start at the beginning with the terrorist attacks of October 7th. There's been a lot of speculation and reporting about the degree of Iranian involvement, but Tehran has repeatedly stressed that it had no direct role in Hamas's operation. What's your read on that?
Look, I've seen the reports from various sources. Mostly what we have here is, the claim at least, but repeatedly claimed by various folks, including the Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, that they were not involved in this directly, that this was done by the Palestinians for the Palestinian cause. I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that the Iranians were in the know in terms of the extent and the viciousness of the attacks on the 7th of October by Hamas against Israel. But the reality is there's no other country on earth that has helped Hamas militarily and perhaps even maybe financially, although there are other countries that compete on that front, than has been the case with Iranian support for Hamas. So the Iranians obviously, as far as I can tell now, over a month into this conflict, have had two policy objectives. Number one, to diplomatically gain as much ground as possible in the region. And we just saw that with the speech by President Ibrahim Raisi at the Islamic conference just held in Riyadh, which we can perhaps get to later on. So they want to make points, score points, I should say, diplomatically, and turn, if you will, the table against Israel and Israel's friends, both those in the region, but also beyond, mainly the United States. But the second objective of Iran is very clear as far as I can tell, which is to make sure they're not dragged into a war. Because a war involving Iran and Israel, from an Iranian perspective, and I think rightly so, isn't a war between Iran and the Israelis. It would essentially be a war between Iran and the United States. And that is a heavy lift for the Iranians, and I'm just not sure that they want to go there. And for that reason, I think they're trying to stay out of it and not get themselves involved in the actual military side of this war between Israel and Hamas.
Following up on that, Alex, kind of post-October 7th, can you drill down a little bit more granularly on how Iran has responded to the conflict and how that response has changed over the course of about 5 weeks now?
I mean, it's been consistently one of saying this was within Hamas' ability and the right to do so, that the Palestinians are a people colonized and that any colonized nation has the right, in fact, the duty, if you want to listen to the Islamic Republic leaders, to fight for their freedom. And that's what Hamas is doing. That is obviously the Iranian narrative, very much a contested one, but that is their narrative. I think over the last few weeks, that narrative, as we see the images coming out of Gaza, is one that more and more people are subscribing to or have sympathy for, at least. That, from Iran's position, is a win. Iran right now feels that the war of narratives is one where they are doing better than their certainly regional rivals that are at best quiet. If you look at the countries that have signed up to the Abraham Accords, none of them are out there speaking loudly in defense of Israel, of the Abraham Accords. In fact, they're silent. And that silence for the Iranians means that they are doing better on that sort of war of words between or among the various countries that are divided on the issue of Israel and Hamas. I think the Iranians, in terms of where we are right now, as I said, a month into this conflict, Ibrahim Raisi's speech in Riyadh just a few days ago at the Conference of Islamic Nations was quite telling. Now, as a speaker, he's always pretty loud. Ibrahim Raisi gets very energetic, and it was probably the loudest speech at the summit. But if you listen to the words and the sort of radical message from the words of Ibrahim Raisi, they were even more radical in many ways than the usual Iranian speech against Israel. And there's a reason for that. And that reason is those leaders in that gathering had all kind of moved in the direction of adopting anti-Israeli positions. So for the Iranians to stand out, they had to go even further out and adopt, radical language that would stand out, that might provide Iran with the leadership platform. Because that's the point I want to make. Underneath all the sort of developments that we're seeing, there is a competition, a geopolitical competition among key Islamic states out there. And actually, I would narrow it down on maybe Iran and Turkey and say, these countries are trying to take the mantle of the Islamic world and say, they speak for the Muslims, the 1.6 billion or so around the world. So Raisi didn't say it in so many words, but basically his speech was something along the lines, Mr. Erdogan, it's very nice that you take in a harsh line against Israel, but you haven't really supported Hamas or the Palestinians militarily the way we have. That you might provide offices in Turkey, but that's not how you fight the Israeli occupation. That was Raisi's message. So there is this sort of competition for leadership. And there is no doubt for the Iranian regime, the Palestinian issue and the decades of support the Islamic republics given to the Palestinian issue has always been meant to provide Iran with this opportunity to present itself as the legitimate spokesperson of the Islamic world, the entire ummah, if you will. It's always been a steep climb. They have struggled oftentimes to present themselves as such. But right now, with the Gaza war going on, there is a moment here where the Iranians feel like things are essentially working out in their favor.
Turning to the domestic front within Iran, I'm curious, Alex, you touched on comments made by the Supreme Leader and by President Raisi so far. Are there any significant differences of opinion on this issue within the key power centers in Tehran, or is everyone kind of on the same page here?
Honestly, let me just point out first to public opinion, because this is really interesting. Public opinion, and we have no surveys, these public opinion surveys are not allowed on key issues like this inside of Iran. But it's very clear if you look at that, commentaries and the volume of opinions expressed on things such as social media platforms and so on. Overwhelmingly, you get a sense that Iranian public opinion is certainly not pro-Hamas, if not, you could say it's pro-Israel. And again, without getting into why that is playing out the way it is, the way I have always seen how public opinion takes its position against the regime is because the regime, by and large, probably has no more than 20% of the Iranian public support. Whatever the regime is for, automatically a clear majority is against. So the Islamic Republic is for Hamas, is for the armed fight against Israel. Almost by default, the Iranian public opinion, therefore, is against that position, and in this case would be in favor of defending Israel. Now, in Iranian diaspora, you see a much more colorful support for the state of Israel against Hamas, because basically Hamas, being a friend of the Islamic Republic, by definition has to be an enemy of what the Iranian people by and large are aspiring to do, a secular democratic country that they're aspiring to have. So that's how I see it in terms of the big picture public opinion. In terms of fighting over this issue within the regime, nobody really will dare come out and say anything against policies of support for Hamas that's been going on for so long. I mean, that's really too much to ask for people to say, because if the supreme leader is so categorically in favor, and he has repeatedly made that point in his speeches since October 8th, then it's impossible to imagine that folks would come out and risk basically much by taking an opposite position. Yet you find people making the point that, hey, Iran, Islamic Republic, the leadership, be careful. This conflict between Israel and Hamas has the potential to quickly broaden out and become something that looks like a regional war, even if it is by accident. And that means Iran will be right at the heart of it, given Iran's close association with Hamas. And the likes of former President Hassan Rouhani, former Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, they are on record in recent days and weeks saying that's a slippery slope. Please don't take the nation down the path to a war with Israel because that means war with the United States. So that's how you see the criticism. The criticism isn't, oh my God, we've been wrong supporting Hamas or Israel is great. It's articulated in the sense that this could be a slippery slope. This could bring Iran into a conflict that would, be costly for the Iranian people. And I thought Zarif was making that point very explicitly when he said at a panel he was at recently in Tehran, he said, once the Americans start dropping bombs on Iran, if we end up in a conflict with the United States, it's not going to be the leadership whose house is going to be destroyed. It's going to be ordinary Iranians. So there are folks inside the regime, so-called moderates, who are trying to perhaps make parallels to what's going on with the ordinary people in Gaza, saying they didn't necessarily have a say in the attack of Hamas on Israel, but they're paying the consequences. So yes, there's an attempt to create pressure on the regime, on the hardliners, if you will, the ones who are most in support of military support Hamas, by reminding them that if this does go badly for Iran, it's going to be something that might actually risk the survival of the Islamic Republic, because that's what a war involving the United States and Iran invariably has the potential to do.
Alex, in a similar vein, there's currently a sort of messaging war going on between Tehran and Washington. The Iranian foreign minister recently said that an expansion of the scope of the conflict is quote, inevitable, given how Israel is carrying out the war. At the same time, the U.S. is going to great pains to send messages of deterrence to Iran to prevent escalation, deploying two carrier strike groups, a Marine Expeditionary Unit, and most recently a nuclear-capable submarine, as well as, of course, carrying out several rounds of airstrikes now against Iranian-linked assets in eastern Syria. Are those messages being received in Tehran, and how do you think they're affecting the kind of calculus in Iran?
Look, I think there are two main points to underscore, Alistair, in how you very nicely describe where we are in terms of this war of words or messaging that's going on. Number one is on the Iranian side, for sure, this talk of a regional war is not serious. Iran is not interested in a regional war. Iran wants this war to be limited to Israel and the Palestinians. Iran doesn't even want to see its beloved Hezbollah engage in a war with Israel because that might risk the destruction of much of what Hezbollah has built up over the years. And that's not something Iran wants to see because Hezbollah is supposed to be kept as a long-term asset and power projection over Israel for years and maybe decades to come. So they're very careful, but yet they speak this language of the risk of regional war to put pressure, not so much on Israel, but on the United States. So the aim here to put pressure on Washington that in turn can put pressure on Jerusalem to limit the military operations. And there is a reason for that. In an ideal world, the Islamic Republic of Iran would like to see something of Hamas survive this round of conflict. They don't want to see the Israelis succeed in what they've set out to do, which is the entire elimination of Hamas in Gaza. So Iran wants to use some of this messaging to put pressure on the US, Israel, to salvage as much as possible of the Hamas as an organization. But would Iran want to go to war to save Hamas? That, for me, is a categorical no. Iran will rather see Hamas as a political military movement entirely destroyed if it means Iran can stay out of the war. So for me, that is very clear. The fact that the United States doesn't want a regional war, Israel doesn't want a regional war. In fact, I can't point to a single entity other than perhaps Hamas that wants a regional war. We have to be very careful when we sort of listen to some of the language that comes out that suggests something very big is about to happen. All the points on the ground suggest that, in fact, there's much stronger desire to limit this round of conflict than see it broaden out to include other parts of the Middle East.
So I want to turn now to take a little bit of a closer look at the relationship between Iran and Hamas and how it kind of fits into the axis of resistance. Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh was in Tehran not too long ago, and he met with the supreme leader. What, if anything, came out of that meeting? And can you kind of maybe describe the Hamas Iran relationship in a little bit more detail?
Look, I think, it's impossible to tell you, Alistair, what specifically, if anything, came out of that meeting. That was certainly not reported to the outside world. Obviously, the symbolic gesture speaks for itself. Hamas leadership, I'm sure, take some comfort from the fact that here is Iran, a pretty significant regional actor, opening its doors to a senior Hamas leader. So there's that. Did the Iranians perhaps say, we will be with you all the way? Go for it, do whatever you can. I doubt it. To my comment just a few minutes ago, I don't think Iran wants to go to war with Israel in support of Hamas. We've also heard some Hamas leadership complaining that the sort of support that they had anticipated from Iran and Hezbollah more in this case hasn't been forthcoming. So there is some, in fact, perhaps irritation on the part of the Hamas leadership. Look, the bigger picture in terms of Iran Hamas relations, Hamas is a component, one component, but certainly not the key component of what the Iranians in recent years have started referring to of this encirclement strategy of Israel. So you have armed movements, groups on the border of Israel, but it's Hezbollah in the north in Lebanon or pro-Iran groups that are now operating in Syria, to Hamas in Gaza, two reports in recent years of Iran trying to cultivate new armed groups in the West Bank itself, while the Palestinian Authority, which is an entity that hasn't had good relations with Iran. This encirclement strategy isn't just about Hamas, and it will survive if Hamas is entirely eliminated, because as long as Hezbollah is still there, that is probably still good enough for the Iranians. And that's why they're so careful not to be too careless in terms of Hezbollah's involvement. And again, we heard the speech of Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, and he also made the point basically that they weren't going to get involved in this war. This is a war between the Palestinians and the state of Israel. So we can sit here, Alistair, and talk about the long ups and downs in relations between Iran and Hamas. It's a relationship that goes back to at least the early 1990s. There's been moments where things were good, and then, for example, between 2006, 8, and 9, Hamas leaders were receiving cash in suitcases from the likes of General Qasem Soleimani at the time. And then the two fell out over support for Bashar al-Assad. Hamas leadership, we remember, packed up and left Damascus, to Iran's huge disappointment when they moved to new offices in Doha and Qatar, and some of them went to Turkey. The Iranians were disappointed. They felt Hamas had to stick around and help Assad, but Hamas didn't. And that showed that there's actually plenty of daylight between Hamas and Iran. And I think a lot of that daylight is still there. Yes, they have a common enemy in the state of Israel, and to some extent, they have a common enemy in the United States. But the Islamic Republic and Hamas are operating in terms of timeline very differently. Hamas perhaps wants a war with Israel tomorrow, wants to see as many Islamic states join that fight as possible. The Iranians are looking at the challenge of Israel as a decades-long conflict. They're not rushing to fight Israel tomorrow. They think time is on their side. And therefore, as I said, that explains quite a bit in terms of why Iran supports Hamas, but is not really willing to jump over the cliff for the sake of Hamas.
Alex, turning to kind of the broader regional picture, I'm curious to get your thoughts on what this conflict means for Iran's relations with the Arab Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia, given the kind of previous de-escalatory trend that we were seeing in the region. What impact do you think this will have on the March 2023 Iran-Saudi normalization agreement?
Look, I mean, the fact that Ibrahim Raisi, Alistair, was just received by Mohammed bin Salman on Saudi soil, these are all positive if you're sitting in Tehran and you're a supporter of the Islamic Republic. Does it mean that suddenly the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Moroccans, the Sudanese have woken up and have decided that, yes, they do want to see Iranian regional leadership, not just Israel, but on the broader issues? I mean, there is zero evidence of that. And in fact, I think if you look beneath the surface here, I'm assuming the Saudis are as much against Hamas today they were before October 7th. In fact, they probably have more of dislike for Hamas's policies, which they think are risky and fuel the fire of conflict in the region. Yet they can't say that in so many words because they have public opinion in their respective countries that they need to be aware of and take into account. So in the short term, I can't see the Abraham Accords expanding to include Saudi Arabia anytime soon. I mean, if it is going to happen, it will probably have been now delayed by many months, if not many years. I mean, a country like Saudi Arabia needs to worry about public opinion. Yes, they can make the argument for relations with Israel, but not when it means it might destabilize Saudi society because of the anger you have. And you can make the same kind of comparisons to countries like Egypt and so on. And we've seen Arab governments from Jordan to Egypt to the Gulf states across the board. They have had to come out and speak a language that is similar to the language of Iran on Israel because of their public opinion, not because they think the Iranians actually have a long-term viable solution to the Arab on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Armed resistance might sound right in the short term, but when you think about the totality of this conflict going back to 1948, the armed struggle hasn't delivered results, which takes us back to the idea of Abraham Accords and looking for a way to integrate the state of Israel into the Middle East, into the non-Jewish Middle East. I'm hoping in some ways that in the medium to long term, once the dust settles, this is where we're going to go back and have another go of Abraham Accords. But if we ever get to that point, as I said, it will take many months, perhaps many years, because right now, that's not what the conversation is about. The conversation is to stop the war in Gaza, to have the Israelis recognize the fact that there needs to be a political solution and that, the Palestinian issue is not going to go away. And in that, Hamas really succeeded. If that attack on October 7th was deliberately meant to put the Palestine issue at the center of everything in the region, at least for now, Hamas has achieved that strategic objective.
Alex, building on that point, another kind of regional actor that has shifted in very much a similar direction is, of course, Turkey under President Erdogan. You touched on this earlier, but there has been a sort of, on one level, jockeying for kind of rhetorical messaging around this conflict and kind of claiming the mantle of leadership within the Muslim world. I'm curious how you see this affecting the relationship between Iran and Turkey. I mean, it certainly has reversed the previous rapprochement that we were seeing between Turkey and Israel and has brought Ankara and Tehran closer together. Do you think that's sustainable? What are the limits of that? How do you see that dynamic playing out?
So, I mean, look, I've seen some reports in Western media that are talking about, this upcoming trip by Ibrahim Raisi, the Iranian president, to Turkey that's reportedly going to happen by end of November. This is going to perhaps be a groundbreaking moment. Iran and Turkey are going to build on something they achieved recently in the South Caucasus, where they succeeded in reducing tensions over the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, where both sides were sort of competing. They put that aside for now. Can Raisi build on this by agreeing something with Ankara, with the Turks, with President Erdogan, as far as a common sort of Turkish-Iranian front against Israel is concerned? Well, time will show what will come from Raisi's visit to Turkey and whether this Iranian-Turkish common, ground against Israel can be put together. But I would probably, if I had to hazard a guess here, I would say when I look at it big picture, I see a couple of realities. Yes, in the short term, you can see Iranian, Turkish, anti-Israel language move closer to one another. But that doesn't mean much in practical terms. In practical terms, the Republic of Turkey or Türkiye is still very much anchored in the Western security architectures, namely because of its membership of NATO. I cannot see how Turkey could subscribe to anything that the Iranians have put together in the shape of axis of resistance, the sort of various militant groups that are fighting across the various theaters in the Middle East with this anti-American, anti-Israel agenda. Turkey is not going to subscribe to that. That is not, as far as I can tell, in Turkey's interest. So in the long term, I just can't see much of a synergy, fundamental change in Turkish politics. That means Turkey will go in the direction of adopting the Iranian non-compromising position on Israel. And this people forget. Turkey might be upset today, and it is obviously upset at what's happening in Gaza, but Turkey has diplomatic relations with the state of Israel. The Islamic Republic of Iran doesn't even recognize Israel's right to exist. And that is a big gap between Iran and Turkey. And again, I don't think the Turks are going to suddenly drop a policy that goes back to the 1950s of having good relations with Israel just because of this round of conflict. And we shouldn't forget Hamas and Israel, and never mind the long list of Arab-Israeli conflicts. Hamas and Israel since 1987 have engaged in 8 rounds of conflict. In one of them, back in 2009, Turkey sent the flotilla right after the last conflict around 2009. And if you remember, this resulted in the death of a number of Turkish activists. There was a lot of tension between Turkey and Israel at the time. But I do remember vividly as an analyst at the time that Iran was so almost jealous about the amount of attention Turkey got for sending that aid flotilla to Palestinians. And again, reminds me today, years later, that there is this jealousy between Iran and Turkey. So they might speak the language of common Muslim agenda against Israel. But as I mentioned earlier, Alistair, there's also this competition for leadership in the Islamic world. That happened back in 2009. It's happening today. And I just really don't see it go away. And fundamentally, I don't see the Turkish-Iranian positions being in a place where it can merge fundamentally into one. They will still be distinct. They might be anti-Israel, but there will be different anti-Israel positions rooted in different set of agendas that Turkey and Iran each have.
Thanks, Alex. I think that's an excellent point. And I certainly remember the Mavi Marmara incident because I was living in Turkey at the time. And that was definitely a heated moment for sure, certainly on the domestic side in Turkey. We're running short on time here, but before we wrap up, I want to ask a couple of questions about how you see things moving forward, starting with what do you think Iran's red lines are in this conflict? And what's Tehran's endgame here?
I mean, the way I see it, Alistair, Iran's red line is an attempt to bring Iran into this war, into this conflict. You hear members of U.S. Congress, including senators, that are saying the only solution to attacks on Israel stopping is if you take the fight to the Islamic Republic, the mothership, the sponsor of groups like Hamas. Now, if that becomes U.S. policy, then you're talking about Iran being suddenly the primary target. And speaking of red lines, I guess if the survival of the Islamic Republic will be at stake, that is an Iranian red line. That's the sort of moment where you could see the Iranians suddenly being in a position where they can say, this is the moment where you want to unleash Hezbollah and its hundreds of thousands of missiles and anything else you have in the region in terms of your proxy network of the various groups that you've cultivated over years. This is the moment you want to raise the stakes to prevent regime change in Tehran. Otherwise, as I said before, I could see the Islamic Republic being willing to see Hamas entirely destroyed, because the destruction of Hamas doesn't mean the destruction of the Iranian worldview and the axis of resistance. It's one group. It's not the most formidable military group. That would be Hezbollah. So it's one group. And if it's destroyed, well, that's the price you pay. But for now, the Iranians are trying to avoid that, trying to see if they can salvage as much as Hamas as possible. And in the meantime, as I mentioned, they're trying to score as many points as they can on the diplomatic stage. If they can roll back Abraham Accords, that's one thing, but they certainly want to prevent Accords from expanding. That was something also that they had in common interest with Hamas. That goes against directly the Iranian view about what the future of the Middle East should look like. So you have a moment here for Iran to really, if you will, see if it can sell its message better, stronger in ways that it hasn't been able to do in the last few years. And time might be on its side because so much of this will depend on what goes on between Israel and Gaza, the regional public opinion. It's really in many ways shaping the agenda of the various governments in the Middle East. So, the Iranians, I'm sure, are hoping that whatever happens in Gaza will be something that will favor their geopolitical agenda in the near future.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Alex.
Thank you, Alistair.
That's all the time we have for this week. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in and to our production team for all their work on this week's episode. You can find our latest coverage of Iran and the Israel-Hamas War on our website at www.mei.edu. And you can follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.